Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Tripti Arora, and welcome to this international webinar on financing chemicals and waste, polluter pays option. I'm joining in today from New Delhi. I work with IPEN as the regional coordinator for the South Asia region. So let me just give a brief background of the webinar that we're joining for today. So as you know, that the chemical industry generates trillions of dollars in annual sales, but it does not bear the scientific, health, and environmental costs that derive from its activities. Instead, those costs fall on the public, and governments and national authorities regulating chemicals remain sorely underfunded. So financing is a key topic in the current negotiations to develop a new chemicals agreement to replace SICAM, and a working group on this topic will begin in the week of 19th October. In mid-September, CIEL and IPEN released a proposal to finance chemical safety actions by implementing a coordinated tax or fee on chemical producers. So today's webinar will basically talk about this report, which proposes holding chemical producers financially accountable. We're very glad to have you here with us. Let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker for today is Jodi Gandhi. He's a science and technical advisor for IPEN. He's been working with IPEN for, I guess, 20 years now. So Joe has helped coordinate IPEN engagement in SciChem since its first preparatory meeting in 2003 and currently serves as the public interest NGO representative to meetings of the SciChem Bureau. The next speaker is Mr. Nathaniel Eisen. He's a legal fellow with CIEL and he's a 2019 graduate of New York University of School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He was a lead author on the CIEL IPEN report and has also published on the relationship between international trade law and domestic environment regulations. So let's begin this webinar. Just for your information, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing all the material and the recordings with all the participants. So thank you for joining. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Tripti, and thank you to all of you for joining this webinar during webinar season. I will now turn to my screen and start the sharing of it. This is a presentation about how and why the chemical industry should pay for the management of its products. This is a joint effort of CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. There is a detailed report, a summary, and a frequently asked questions document, along with videos in all 6 of the UN languages, and we will share the links to those materials at the end of the presentation. So let's get started with a look at how big the chemical industry actually is. This report from UNEP has some interesting facts about the chemical industry that most people do not think of. The first is it's a very large consumer of energy and the number 3 emitter of carbon dioxide. In addition, the industry will grow substantially in the coming years. And currently, this is the breakdown of sales by region. And what will happen, according to the industry, is by 2030, China will occupy more than 50% of global sales. Now, the size of chemical industry sales is much bigger than most people realize. And in 2017, the estimate was almost $6 trillion US. And the estimate for 2030 is almost double that. Now, you will notice I'm speaking here about trillion US dollars, but none of us are carrying around $1 trillion, and it's difficult to imagine how big that actually is. So let's have a look at how big $1 trillion actually is. So here is a pile of $100 bills, US dollars, and this would fit into a backpack. But if we go up to $1 billion, it's much more serious. This climbs above the guy's waist. There are 2 sets of pallets here totaling 10 of them. And now $1 trillion is on a completely different scale. So now you can see double stacked pallets, a huge array of money. And over on the far left, you can see our guy standing there. Now, the industry does not make this amount of money. In fact, in 1 year, it makes about 6 of these. And in 2030, this is approximately going to double. So that is a huge amount of money. And one of the reasons why the industry is so popular is shown here. First of all, the industry is quite good at internalizing its profits and externalizing its harms. And among these harms are serious impacts on human health and the environment. So what this means is that the industry does not actually pay the true cost of its products. And that's why it is so profitable and can maintain profit margins of 12 to 16%. Now, you've heard the polluter pays principle be mentioned with regards to the chemical industry and other industries. And the polluter pays industry was not invented by NGOs. It actually came from this meeting. These are photos from the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And this meeting agreed on a series of principles, the Rio Principles, and one of them is Rio Principle 16. And this pretty clearly states that environmental costs should be internalized and the polluter should bear the cost of pollution. And this is pretty much analogous to something all of us learned as children, which is that we should clean up our own mess. Now, at the root of the industry's externalized costs, there are 2 facts that come from UNEP. You can see the first of them there on the left is that hazardous chemicals and other types of pollution are still being released in large amounts, and that the chemical industry's pollutants can be found even in our own bodies. So that's a first example of the industry's externalization. Now, it's difficult to put a monetary value on the industry's externalized cost. Here are 3 examples that attempt to do this. The first is with endocrine disrupting chemicals in the European Union. The second deals with volatile organic compounds. And the third deals with childhood lead poisoning due to exposure to paint, lead acid battery recycling, and other sources. And all 3 of these have substantial annual costs. And if you add up just these 3 examples, that is a substantial amount of money. And these are all costs that the industry does not pay. Now, another example of externalized costs deals with pesticide poisoning. This comes from UNEP. And this calculation found that the cost of injury in sub-Saharan Africa due to pesticides was substantially greater than the entire overseas development assistance to these countries, excluding HIV/AIDS. And one other type of serious externalized cost is actually death. And this shocking statistic came from the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics. The former rapporteur is Baskut Tunjak, and he presented this statistic in a report he delivered in 2018 to the UN General Assembly. So we've seen a serious array of these externalized costs, and you might expect that this must mean that governments are substantially funded to enable them to deal with these things and to deal with chemicals management. So let's have a look at the financing of international chemicals agreements. Here are 5 common chemicals agreements that we are familiar with. And now it's reasonable to expect that all of these must have a financial mechanism so that developing and transition countries can implement them. But actually, only 2 of them have a financial mechanism. The first one that has it is the Stockholm Convention, and the other is the Minamata Convention. So let's take a little closer look at 2 of these. Let's look at Stockholm Convention and SciChem. Now, in the Stockholm Convention, they took a look at the needs that developing and transition countries would have, financial needs to implement their obligations under the convention. And here we are comparing these needs to the allocation from the Global Environment Facility, which operates the financial mechanism of the treaty. And the difference between the needs and the amount of money is more than 10 times. And this is one of the few treaties that even has a financial mechanism. SciChem is even more serious. Here is the funding. This is 0.2% of the GEF7 funding goes to SciChem. And that's quite ironic because SciChem, due to its design, has the broadest scope of all chemicals agreements. So it's covering most chemical substances, but ironically has the smallest funding of all chemicals agreements. Now, the independent SciChem evaluation took a look at some of these items, and they drew a direct line between the lack of funding and the ability of the agreement to actually accomplish its objectives. And this lack of funding was not only for countries that are trying to implement this agreement, but also for the Secretariat. For more than half of this 10-year period, they had not just a little bit short, but a huge shortfall in their annual budget. And perhaps the most serious fact to come out of the SciChem evaluation is shown here. The original goal of SciChem was to narrow the gap between countries, that is, between developing and transition countries and developed countries. And so this means that if you get to the end of the SciChem agreement and the gap is still the same, then you have failed to accomplish your goal. But in this case, the gap is not the same. It's even bigger than it was when we started. And part of the reason for that has been the lack of sufficient funding. Now, what you have seen so far is sort of a discussion and some examples of why the chemical industry should pay for financing of its products. But to explain a little bit more about how the industry should pay, I would like to invite Nathaniel Eisen from CIEL to inform us about how this can be done. So Nathaniel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joe, and hello, everyone. So picking up where Joe left off, in 2013, countries adopted a new framework solution to raising additional funds for implementing SciChem, Stockholm, and the other chemicals treaties, known as the integrated approach to financing. Now, the integrated approach has 3 pillars, as they're commonly referred to: dedicated external financing, industry involvement, and mainstreaming in development planning. Now, these pillars are often portrayed as equal, when in fact, at least historically, industry involvement has been perhaps the smallest, and while industry involvement should be the largest in order to operationalize the polluter pays principle. And furthermore, the integrated approach has not delivered on its goals of raising an order of magnitude of funds greater than was available previously, and that corresponds to the scope of the needs. So our proposal is a way of addressing both of those challenges. And I want to start by saying that this is a proposal that builds on ideas that have been put forward previously, not only by CIEL and IPEN, but also by parties to the treaties. For example, a submission from 2019 by the African group, the Latin America and Caribbean group, and a number of countries in Asia to SciChem proposed operationalizing the industry and involvement pillar of the integrated approach through agreed to levies on industry. And of course, internalizing costs within industry has been part of the goals of SciChem from the beginning. Now, our proposal, I will first outline the basic sketches of it and then go into the justification for a couple of design features. We're proposing that countries agree to implement a coordinated tax or fee on the production of basic chemicals. Basic chemicals, also known as chemical feedstocks, are the first manufactured chemicals often derived from fossil fuels or minerals, and they form the basis for all subsequent intermediate and final chemical products. They account for about 2/3 of the production by volume of all industrial chemicals and about 40% of the sales of revenues. And while there are a few different definitions of basic chemicals, we proposed in the report a list of about 35 that could be the base for the tax. Now, how this would work in practice is every country with a basic chemicals industry physically located within its borders would agree to implement a 0.5% tax on the production value of these basic chemicals. Those countries could call this a tax, they could call it a fee. It doesn't really matter, so long as under the national legislation, it's able to be earmarked such that the revenues could flow directly into a global fund for chemical safety. This could be the existing special program or a new fund built for this purpose. This fund will then make disbursements to developing and transition countries to establish or expand their regulatory infrastructure for the safe management of chemicals and wastes. We've calculated, based on the industry's figures for the sales of basic chemicals in 2018, that just this 0.5% tax, if implemented globally, could raise $11.5 billion US, or roughly 85 times the current amount of financing going into implementing the chemicals treaties from the GEF and the special program combined. We further calculated, based on some older data, that even if just the top 10 countries in terms of value of basic chemicals produced were to implement this tax, it would raise on the order of $8 billion US. Now, I want to explain the thinking behind a couple of the design elements from this proposal. And the first is the selection of basic chemicals as the base for the tax. We chose basic chemicals not because these are especially dangerous chemicals per se, though of course some of them are. Rather, it's that you can raise a lot of money relatively easily through a tax on basic chemicals. These chemicals represent a relatively small number of products. Again, we're proposing just 35 compared to the universe of over 10,000 industrial chemicals currently in production. And this small number of products is produced by a relatively small number of producers as well, which makes the tax much easier to administer. And yet, again, because of the substantial sales of basic chemicals, you can still raise adequate funding through a tax on just these subset at a very low rate. And this goes to the goals of our proposal. which is chiefly to fund the management systems countries need just to get a basic handle on regulating chemicals and protecting their populations. Other taxes can still be used in combination with the proposed fee to discourage the use of especially harmful chemicals, or countries can use the regulatory infrastructure to develop bans on the most hazardous of chemicals, which of course we would support. This tax does not preclude those other options, rather it would enable them. The second feature I wanted to explain was the selection of a coordinated approach. This is an issue of what is possible in isolation versus what is possible through cooperation. Now, in the integrated approach under industry involvement, the countries made reference to the use of national level cost recovery approaches. And indeed, several of the panelists have worked with countries to develop such approaches. And both international and national cost recovery are very important to this picture. However, for a number of reasons, national only cost recovery approaches have proven inadequate and are likely to continue to be so. And there are three reasons that we will highlight here. The first is just that national only cost recovery does not generate sufficient revenue typically to fund all of the activities countries need to manage chemicals. The second is that there are very real fears countries may have that if they implement a tax or fee on industry in isolation, it will incentivize what little manufacturing industry is already present to disappear or disincentivize new industry from siting there. Finally, national-only approaches fail to fully implement the polluter pays principle. As many of you are no doubt aware, many of the health and environmental costs countries face from chemicals come from chemicals hidden in waste streams, whether that's electronic waste or plastics, or even from chemicals migrating across national borders, as we've seen with persistent organic pollutants. In both of these scenarios, it's very difficult for countries to identify the responsible parties, much less force them to bear the costs of their pollution. Instead, we should think of the chemicals industry as a whole as the polluter, and that requires an international or coordinated approach to fully implement the polluter pays principle. A coordinated approach has the further virtues of providing a level playing field for countries implementing the tax, reducing the sphere around incentivizing industry exit, and it can raise significant revenue. So in summary, this proposal responds to a problem of developing and economies in transition not having sufficient funding to implement their obligations under the international chemicals treaties or to keep their populations safe from the harmful effects of chemicals. It does so through a coordinated fee on the production of basic chemicals, which we have calculated will raise significantly more revenue than is currently going to funding management through a very small fee on a highly profitable industry that has become so profitable through internalizing profits while externalizing costs. And in doing so, it improves on the existing framework of the integrated approach to financing by fully implementing the polluter pays principle. We are really looking forward to hearing your feedback on the proposal and taking some of your questions now. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. And here is the link to find the materials that include the report, videos, a frequently asked questions piece, and also a brief summary, a 4-page summary of the report. So why don't we stop talking here? I'll stop sharing the screen and we can be ready for any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joe and Nathaniel. It was a wonderful presentation. And we already have 2 questions. So I'll just speak them out. So the first is that the sale included pharmaceutical industry, which produces none of the hazardous chemicals like pesticides or POPs or lead, as highlighted in earlier transparencies. So, should pharmaceutical sale also be included in this?
The proposal actually does not include pharmaceuticals when we make the calculation necessarily. It's a calculation based on basic chemical production, regardless of what those basic chemicals will be used for. In addition, the production of pharmaceuticals itself often uses a lot of toxic chemicals. And in countries where this takes place, it's often a very polluting industry. In fact, this is one of the SciChem emerging policy issues. So there's been more attention recently to pharmaceutical pollution. I hope I'm answering the question, but if not, please ask again and we will try to answer it.
Thank you, Joe. The second question is, kindly share your opinion as to why much lesser funding to SciChem is there as compared to Stockholm, despite SciChem dealing with all the chemical substances, which obviously does not match to the required amount of funding.
Okay, I'll take a crack at that one also. There's no sort of clear explanation about this. You're right. The agreement that has the broadest scope should get substantial funding considering its scope. But one of the reasons which is often offered as to why this situation exists is that SciChem is not legally binding, and that this makes it harder for donor countries to convince their ministries that they should give money to an agreement that has no legal obligation for implementation. Despite that, SciChem tackles important chemical safety issues that more than 100 governments have agreed are extremely important and that are not covered by any other treaty. So there's a serious disconnect between tackling these problems that everyone agrees on need to be addressed and the amount of money that should go to it. And so what we've tried to think of is a way to finance chemical safety actions in developing and transition countries more broadly, regardless of the treaty. I mean, Basel Convention and Rotterdam Convention have no financing either, and those are also important. And hopefully this will at least start on answering your question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. So, what are the obstacles we have to overcome with the chemicals industry themselves to agree with this proposal?
So convincing the chemical industry, well, we have not yet had the opportunity to present the proposal to the chemical industry. So we do not have any sort of direct comments from them. In some media stories, they have commented, as they usually do when they are asked to contribute finances, that they should not have to do this. They disagree with paying sort of cash financing. However, there are an increasing number of governments that are quite interested in this type of arrangement, that is the industry paying. And in fact, even the European Union 5 years ago came out and said that they were having a hard time explaining to their member state governments why governments should be paying for this. And they even said it that bluntly. But the decision about implementing this kind of tax really does not come from the industry. It comes from governments. So they can have their opinion, but it's governments who will decide if the tax will be implemented or not. And we hope that we can get cooperation among principal governments that where manufacturing of these substances occurs, to agree to implement the tax and then to give that money to an international fund. What we're proposing is not trivial. We understand it's a serious thing. There's the agreement among the countries to implement a tax, and then there is the need to have an appropriate place for the money to go. And those details are all very important. But ultimately, it's political will of governments that will determine if something like this can go forward. And so we intend to encourage that political will.
Thank you so much, Joe. We have another question. Would an international tax support a process of national financing simultaneously, or would the industry be less likely to support national financing if paying already internationally?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I think my direct answer would be that it is obviously not designed to be an alternative options, either one or the other. And our sense is that, and to respond directly to your questions, yes, industry, if such a proposal could be implemented, industry would probably argue that, well, if it already pays this fee, then it should not pay any other taxes or fee or not support the development of national management. But of course, this is not the objective. And what the objective is that this money would be made available to support national development and national management as well. That would be my simple answers, because right now there are still too many unknowns as to where and how this would be put in place to respond affirmatively one way or the other. Surely the industry would try to use this to relent from paying national management. On the other hand, considering the levels of sums that would be raised, it might actually work it might actually work well for national management measures as well. But again, because there are so many unknowns into how this would be implemented and what the reactions would be, it's hard to respond definitively to the answer. And I don't know if Joe or Nathaniel, you want to add anything to this?
I can add just a small little detail. We did not say this explicitly during the presentation, but let's say there is a developing country which has basic chemicals production. Well, we would like them to also implement this tax, and they would send the money to the international fund, but they might actually receive more money from the fund than they are sending to the fund. So having basic chemicals production does not disqualify you from getting funding. And in fact, you may get more funding than you actually send. So this is another feature that we hope to use to convince certain well-known developing countries that have substantial chemicals production. Thanks for this difficult question.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Joe. We have more like a comment, not a question. So he wants to know your opinion on the suggestion below. So matching of industry in a developed country with the same in the developing to help out with chemicals and health issues. And there's another one. So NGOs from their end with limited resources, but there is much more needed from the government to make industry sector aware of the multilateral agreement with respect to chemicals, especially the ones that are ratified.
Okay, I'll take the first one there. It's kind of a difficult one. Maybe David or Nathaniel would like to do the second one. So the first one, I think, was sort of matching for capacity building purposes, industries in developed countries with their counterparts in developing countries. And the chemical industry is actually interested in doing this. And they have made references to do this. Of course, one sort of thing that needs to be overcome is a fairly common experience where a developed country company has a branch manufacturing products in a developing country, but the manufacturing standards are not the same. And that's something that the company has control over. And one of the problems that we have encountered over the years is that developed country companies enjoy going to countries with very weak laws and weak regulatory infrastructure. And then they like to say, we're in full compliance with all laws surrounding this particular manufacturing process. And they say that even when there is no law. So that's a problem that needs to be overcome. But it's a good point about the capacity of the industry in developing countries. And one of the SciChem emerging policy issues where this is being discussed in a very tangible way is actually in lead paint elimination. In which small to medium-sized companies are getting training on how to eliminate lead paint in their manufacturing process as part of the whole elimination process. So it's a good point. Thank you. And maybe David or Nathaniel would like to take the second one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of features in the second comment. So one is about sharing information with the industry located in developing countries about their obligations and the requirements under both national and domestic law. And that is something that funding from this fund could certainly be used for, just making that information more readily available, as well as then providing enforcement. And the other is about the role of NGOs. One area of improvement we'd like to see in the special program, were it to be the funding vehicle for this coordinated fee, would be to finance projects by NGOs in developing countries and economies in transition. Currently, funds are only made available to national governments, but civil society has a very important role to play in sharing information, in monitoring, and all of that. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you. We have one more question. The more governments are taxing industry to address the pollution, the more industry is finding other strategies to reduce the taxes to be paid via CSR or other strategies. So do you have any propositions to also incorporate this kind of situation? So to avoid proposing solutions which will not work in some regions.
Yes, this is sort of along the lines of some previous questions. How do we sort of deal with the industry's refusal, I guess? And you are right. Corporate social responsibility approaches are often proposed as the contribution. And one of the interesting documents that has emerged over the last year is an evaluation of this integrated approach that Nathaniel described. So in the approach, the industry involvement portion of the integrated approach was examined by UNEP, and they found it's vague. There's very little evidence for any tangible funding coming from it, and that there needed to be some way to be clear about what this means. And in fact, what we're doing is actually giving a procedure to operationalize what governments have already agreed to. Now, industry, of course, will try to escape their responsibility with CSR approaches or through other means. And that's where the political will part of it will become very important, the political will of governments. And what we intend to do is apparently beginning next week, or sometime very soon, there will be a finance working group. This will be a virtual working group. This is part of the Beyond 2020 process. And some of these points about industry's financial responsibility already exist in the draft document. They're not agreed to, but they exist in brackets in the document. And we intend to basically explain our proposal and carry out an actual discussion within this group about this proposal, either in written form. Well, we will certainly make a written submission, but we will pursue a discussion and feedback about this proposal. And then we will have to sort of make a plan about how to deal with industry justification for not doing it. But I'll just return to a previous point, which is that ultimately they can do all the CSR approaches they like, but it's governments who will decide if the tax will be or the fee will be levied or not. And so that's where the political will needs to come from. All of us are aware that political will is a challenge, and that's why the process needs us.
Some taxes are designed to discourage, for example, emissions of a particularly harmful substance, and those taxes, but they might also be designed to then raise money to fund the challenges posed by those very same emissions. And there's often a paradox there between the goals of raising enough money versus deterring the harmful behavior. And again, sort of going back to some of the rationale I explained earlier, that would not really be a problem with this tax, which focuses on the raising revenue goal.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Joe. I guess that's all the questions that we had. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations, Joe, Nathaniel, and thank you, David, for being here. And thank you to all the participants for participating in today's session. And as I mentioned, we'll share all the presentations and the recordings with all of you, and the report and the Q&A and the video is already there on IPEN's and CIEL's website. You can just go there and have a look. So thank you so much. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Tripti.
For moderating.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.